Last week we considered the credibility-stretching account of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus miraculously feeds the multitude with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. This week's reading is another mind-bender. Jesus walks on the stormy waters of the Sea of Galilee. He then invites Peter to join him, and later, when Jesus climbs aboard the boat, the storm is stilled. What are we to make of this? This is one of those so-called nature miracles that challenge a physicist like me. An individual healing is easier to accept than something as dramatic as this. It's problematic because, in essence, the miracle is one of physics, not biology. Skeptics have proposed an optical illusion to explain what happened. If that were the case, however, it can only be assumed that the disciples would have quickly discovered their error and the story wouldn't have been preserved for posterity. I think instead of getting bogged down with the question, did it happen, and if so, how, it's better to ask, what does it all mean? In other words, how would this story be understood by Jews of the day? As we saw with the feeding of the 5,000, that event pointed to someone greater than Moses being here. And so perhaps we can expect this account of Jesus walking on the water to also reveal something about his identity. Matthew starts by Jesus telling the disciples to go ahead of him by boat to the other side of the lake. Jesus then went up the mountainside by himself to pray, alone. After Matthew's dramatic account of the feeding of the multitude, this has echoes of Moses going up the mountain to meet with God. The boat containing the disciples was some considerable distance from the land, and it was, we're told, nighttime. Moreover, they were experiencing a storm and were struggling against a headwind. The boat was taking a beating. However, unlike an earlier similar story where Jesus reportedly calmed a storm, there's no mention here that the disciples were afraid that they would drown. We're then told that somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m., Jesus came walking to them on the lake. What's going on? Is it a trickster? A magician? An evil spirit? Of course they know that people don't walk on water, and so they rationalize what they saw as being a ghost, a spirit from the dead, and they were terrified. Let's pause and remember that in that culture, the unpredictable, turbulent sea symbolized the embodiment of all that was evil. The psalmist and the writers of Job and Proverbs speak of the stormy sea and its monsters as dark powers that threaten the goodness of God's created order. Only God can confine chaos. That is made clear in the opening lines of Genesis 1. And for the Jews, this was vividly demonstrated in the crossing of the Red Sea at the time of Moses, and later when Joshua led the people through the river Jordan when entering into the Promised Land. And this imagery is also referenced at the end of the book of Revelation, where the new heaven and earth is described as no longer having a sea, signifying that evil and chaos will be eradicated. But for now, chaos and order coexist in tension, one that is destructive, as in hurricanes and fires, and, ironically, creative too. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Jews understood that God alone could tame or limit the powers of the sea. We heard this in our earlier reading from Job. God alone treads on the waves of the sea. And while we think of walking on the water as defying gravity, first-century Jewish readers would see Jesus as exercising a prerogative that belongs to God alone. Jesus then speaks to his disciples, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Those words, "it is I," are the equivalent of the divine "I am" that God spoke to Moses from the burning bush. In walking on the water, Jesus does what only God can do. And now he speaks words that Jews associated with God himself. We need to pause and take a deep breath and absorb all this. These mysterious actions and words link Jesus with God, the liberator and redeemer of Israel, who is at the same time the creator of the world and the victor over chaos. Note, this need not be seen as a publicity stunt that commanded allegiance. No one else was there except his disciples, and Jesus already had their loyalty. Rather, it was an unforgettable teaching moment that revealed to the disciples exactly who it was they were following. This is an epiphany, a revelation, and we should see this incident in the same light as the transfiguration that Matthew will later report on in chapter 17. Matthew is the only gospel writer who presents the subsequent dialogue between Jesus and Peter and his walking on the water. And I want to spend the rest of this sermon exploring that aspect. Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." It's a bold, perhaps impetuous thing to ask. Yet Peter knows that this is not something that he can do on his own initiative. Jesus must empower him to do so. Whatever God has endowed Messiah Jesus, Jesus shares it with Peter and invites him to come towards him on the water. And we're told that Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. This act of obedience takes great faith and courage, and let's not overlook or belittle that fact by what happens next. Bonhoeffer writes, "Peter had to lead the ship and risk his life on the sea in order to learn his own weaknesses and the almighty power of his Lord. If Peter had not taken the risk, he would never have learned the meaning of faith." I'll talk a little bit more about the meaning of faith shortly. As Peter walks, he gets distracted by the wind and so takes his eyes off Jesus. His faith quickly turned into fear, and he begins to sink. He cries out, "Lord, save me!" and immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Jesus then gently rebukes Peter. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" Such criticism must not overlook the fact that Jesus earlier obeyed the command of Jesus to come. And note that the Greek word for doubt here implies vacillating back and forth rather than habitual skepticism. We could therefore see this as a story about a faithful follower of Jesus who becomes overwhelmed by circumstances around them and so lose their nerve. Faith mixed with fear and doubt is where many Christians find themselves. Take heart. Jesus can still work with faltering faith. We read in the book of Acts about the man of faith that Peter became. Walking by faith involves learning to live with uncertainty and learning to remain focused on Jesus rather than the towering problems that threaten to engulf us or the critical opinion of others. And that learning will inevitably have its ups and downs. We're human. I often say that the line between faith and foolishness is thin. And sometimes we may wonder which side we're on. Now that phrase, "you of little faith," could also be translated, "you of little trust." And I think that makes better sense in this context. Faith, you see, is much more than belief. It's not enough to say, "I believe in God," or simply recite the creeds. The real question is, do we trust God? As Curtis Holson puts it, the opposite of faith is not doubt, but distrust. Faith involves trust, and trust involves risk, and trust is demonstrated by action and obedience. We see that in Peter getting out of the relative security of his boat and taking those first steps towards Jesus. And the notion that faith involves trust, risk, and action describes all human relationships, because faith is relational or personal. Peter trusted Jesus. Do we trust God? Dare we as individuals and as a church trust God to the point that we risk all, and being aware of the dangers, still act? Will we, like Peter, lead the security of our boats and courageously follow the invitation of Jesus to come? William Willimon summarizes it like this: if Peter had not ventured forth and not obeyed the call to walk on the water, then Peter would never have had this great opportunity for recognition of Jesus and of being rescued by Jesus. He continues, I wonder if too many of us are merely splashing about in the safe shallows and therefore have too few opportunities to test and deepen our faith. This story implies that if you want to be close to Jesus, you have to venture forth out on risk, and you have to prove his promises through trusting his promise through risk and venture. Matthew concludes, when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were on the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. The wind dying down reverts back to that earlier epiphany, and Jesus being witnessed as master of the winds and the waves. And through this experience, the disciples come to recognize Jesus is the Son of God, and they worship him. That act in itself would be blasphemous to devout Jews. The title Son of God means belonging to God, and is synonymous with Messiah, or God's chosen one. It's only through the turbulent experiences that arise along the journey of faith that we can truly know that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. In these uncertain times, and in whatever we're personally facing in this coming week, may we hear the words of Jesus, have courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Amen. Our next song is He Will Hold Me Fast.